In school, cooking was much different than cooking at home.
As clan mothers, we held a lot of responsibility.
They sent us to boarding school.
When America was in the midst of the Great Depression of the 1920s and early 1930s, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt started a program called the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. One of the great programs to come out of that was the Writers Project. The Oneidas were in the Writers Project and given an opportunity to write their life stories and get paid for participating. Numerous journals were collected, stored, and forgotten until the late 1990s, when they were found in storage at the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. The stories are crucial to unlocking our history during the 1800s to early 1900s.
It was not only oral history, but it was the preservation of the Oneida language, because those who were selected to work in this project not only could read and write English very well, but they could also speak Oneida fluently and could write Oneida. The journals covered everything. They covered everyday life, told how the roads were repaired and how people had to contribute to that, told about the foods that were prepared by the women while men worked collectively, told about quarrying stone for the stone church in the parish hall, told about people who were born, people who died, epidemics, even the immigration from New York State, because the people that were being interviewed in 1939, 40, and 41 were people who remembered the immigration or remembered immediately, because they may have been born here, but they were told by their parents about what it was like to immigrate from mid-New York State through the Great Lakes and then to come to Green Bay and make a settlement. They talked about all of these things. It's very detailed. It's their life and times as they saw it.
When the Oneidas migrated from New York State to Wisconsin, they came to a strange place, and the other western tribe of Indians were somewhat hostile to them, so they had to be continually on guard in case of sudden attack. Their chiefs were always talking to the people that they must cooperate in order to survive. They lived in the woods in groups, and the groups were not far from each other, so they could easily get in touch with one another in case of danger. In those days, they shared their homes, food, and clothing. In times of sickness, there was always someone to nurse the sick. When the reservation opened and the white people began to settle here, that was the beginning of change. It was impossible for the Oneidas to remain the same.
When we migrated from New York to Wisconsin, we signed a treaty with the Menominee Nation in 1822 to share all of their lands. That was for 8 million acres of land. It was all the way up to Badenoch, Michigan, and to all of Door County, all of the east side of Lake Winnebago down to Milwaukee. That was taken from us in 1831 by the Stambaugh Treaty, and there was a big political fracas in this area by the French, previously fur traders who had married Menominee ladies and lived in Green Bay. And these French fur traders influenced the tribal leadership of the time, the chiefs, and said that's not a good deal to let the New York Indians live on our land. The Menominee chiefs went to Washington and said, we got to do something with this. And what they did was send out Colonel Stambaugh and said, settle it. I call Colonel Stambaugh a hitman because he came just specifically to do that job. And he would reduce the Oneida's interest in 8 million acres of land to 500,000 acres in one fell swoop without any say-so from the Indians who had purchased it, us. We had purchased it. We made two separate payments, one in 1821, one in 1822.
At the time of the marriage of my parents, it was still the general custom to marry according to the old Oneida ways, and that was for the mothers of the young people to dicker for and arrange a marriage of their children. Only, as I have mentioned before, the powers that be in this particular case was an overbearing, egotistical aunt. Consequently, my mother, she told me, was married to a total stranger. From this union, 9 children were born. Death, in some form or another, claimed all but a brother and me. My father's land was in the southern part of the Oneida Reservation. It lay just on the inside of the boundary line. It comprised of about 100 acres. As my grandfather had died, my father was operating the farm at the time of my birth. I am told by my parents that I gave my first squawk at their residence, with an Oneida midwife in attendance. That also was the custom then. The house where I was born was a hovel, though considered a respectable home locally at that time. It was a log house. Although I spent only a limited time there, I still recall that it contained 2 rooms on the ground floor and 1 large room upstairs. A frame barn stood. It appeared to me about a mile to the north, although it must have been only about 50 yards. Here we kept our cow and horses, and here also I trapped chickens by pulling a string which closed the door to the barn driveway.
Although many of these original log homes are gone, like the journals, many of these cabins are being preserved. Life inside these cabins was hard but simple, and each family member had a special role. Even extended families lived together, forming special bonds.
We used to welcome my uncle whenever he came to our home, especially in the winter. He was my mother's brother and was one of those roving, independent characters who felt that marriage would be too much fetters for him.
Some hunting and fishing and stories to tell you.
He was a hunter, fisherman, storyteller,
As he was digging and digging and digging for my fish.
and fortune teller.
Well, hi, ladies.
This latter qualification was the cause of his great popularity among the young lassies.
Can you really tell us when we're going to be married?
They would want to know how soon and to whom they would be married. He would have them shuffle the cards, cut them into several smaller piles, and pick out their representative face card. Then he would lay them out, 9 cards across and 7 down. But before he started reading the cards, I was generally invited to take a walk.
The relationships forged between family members help the tradition of passing down our history orally from one generation to another. One of the earliest forms of written history was a wampum belt, and it was said that the belt would be brought out once a year so the agreements, treaties, and the meanings behind the belt would be renewed with the people so no one would forget. When the Europeans came to the Americas, they began to write about us, and they interpreted who we were in their written version. The only other written history we have is that of the letters written to our chiefs to communicate with the president during the 1800s, and those were mostly about many issues that were affecting them. The Oneida villages here in Wisconsin had a way of communicating with each other, and that was in the form of a runner.
Long ago, it was the custom of the Oneidas when someone met an accident, and if they died all of a sudden, a certain man was told and he would run on the road. Ever so often, he would holler a certain way, and when people heard him, they knew that someone died from an accident. They considered this a sacred event, and they were shocked when they heard him holler that way. The runner would say, "Guaha," and they could hear him a long ways. They used to call him the messenger.
Runners were sent from one village to the other to announce the event. And it not only happened with such things as deaths, but such things as celebrations or perhaps an accident. When a person died, everybody in the entire reservation knew because they could hear the tolling of the bell at the church. If the person were 12 years old, then they would toll the bell 12 times, and if they were 90, they would also toll the bell about 90 times. So yes, and if someone had been ill, you could very well figure out about who had passed on.
As time went on, runners were replaced by phones and now email. Technology has changed traditions. One of those traditions practiced by many tribes is called the 10-day feast. We hold this special ceremony for people that have passed away. We say that when a person passes away, they travel to all the places in which they have been. On the 9th day, a feast is prepared, an empty chair is set out, and a food plate is set for that person. We say that that food is intended to nourish that person on their journey. On the 10th day, the food plate is buried and the spirit is released to continue on its journey.
A lot of things with our culture went underground. And that was, because the church didn't approve of it, the government didn't approve of it. And then in the 1970s is when we began to do the revitalization. And I was part of that movement we knew we were Indian. We're the pride in being Indian was starting to be reborn because we'd all been taught to be ashamed of being Indian. Our parents had, our grandparents, we'd all been taught to be ashamed. We started to turn that around. One of our talents and artistic forms of expression we've brought back is raised beadwork. And it takes a long time to do this work. It's beautiful. The colors are vibrant. It reflects our culture. And I don't think people realize what it takes to do this beautiful beadwork.
Just to keep in touch with the old pots.
We've brought back the pottery. We're wonderful. We have this fantastic elder, Rose Kerstetter, who came home and has inspired people to be potters again and brought out talents people didn't know they had.
My name is Rose Kerstetter. I'm an Oneida elder, and one of the things I do is making traditional pottery. I believe it was about 3,000 years ago we started to make pottery, and we used the pottery for storage and for eating purposes, cooking purposes. When we stopped making pottery, when the Europeans came over and had traded metal pots with handles for furs, we threw out the clay and we threw out the techniques for making the good clay. And so that was lost. You can make a pot today, but it's not the same. Well, the fact that I keep baking it and teaching it, it is my idea of helping to continue our traditions. We have got to do that. We've got to keep doing our traditions, or we'll end up not having anything.
My dad, he knew he was Oneida. He knew Oneida was a kind of Indian, but he had no knowledge about the Confederacy or what it meant to be Iroquois or about our ceremonies or a longhouse, for that fact. He just knew that Oneida was an Indian, and Indian meant being less than everybody else. And that's how he grew up. That's what he was taught. So when he got to be a young man and he started hearing these words of these elders, telling him, yeah, you're Oneida, you're Iroquois, you're Oniote'ag, you're Haudenosaunee. That's something to be proud of. You have that gift of identity that a lot of Indian nations don't have anymore. They've lost that. So do whatever you can, to keep that going, to carry that on, and to learn as much as you can. And so he's kind of over the rest of his life he's really taken that to heart. He's done that consistently. That's what his focus has been. And it's gone that way for a lot of people in this community.
Traditions, they are the center of every race and religion. In a changing world, they're difficult to hold on to. For us, the Oneida tribe, women played a substantial role within our tribe. The Oneida tribe is matriarchal, which means power is based in our women.
The women that were called clan mothers in olden times when the chiefs were in power were the mothers of chiefs, or aunt, or some close relative.
The clan mothers were sort of guardian to the reigning chiefs. They guided them and advised them. If a chief's behavior was not satisfactory to the people, someone had to report to his guardian, and the mother would investigate his case. The clan mothers cooked for the chiefs when they held their council. They sat and listened to the discussions, but they were supposed to be silent. If a question of war with other tribes or white settlers came up, then the woman could favor for or against it.
On whichever side the clan mothers favored, the chiefs always agreed with them.
Women were were called a matrilineal society because you get your clan from your mother. You're either turtle, bear, or wolf in our world, and that comes from your mother. And also with those chiefs, it's the clan mothers who select the chiefs. And it's a beautiful thing because it's like the clan mothers are usually the oldest women in that clan. And it's not necessarily hereditary, it can be, but that clan mother, to be a clan mother, they watch the young people grow. And they can tell who will be a good chief, who will be a good clan mother, who will be a good faith keeper. And they select them and they train them as they're growing. They see those qualities of leadership, of people who care about our nation, who are concerned for our people, who have vision. So that clan mother also has the authority to what we call, we call it dehorn, because their gustoe that they wear, their headdress has deer antlers on. So we call it dehorning, or you would call it impeaching, with 3 warnings. So if they see that that chief is not listening to the people, he's not taking their voice to the meetings, or his behavior is out of line, she can give him 3 warnings on his behavior. And if he doesn't listen after the 3 warnings, he's out of there.
One of the first big changes that happened to our people was with the fur trade. The women did the agriculture, and the men did the hunting and bringing in the meat for the meals. With the fur trade, now the men were gone, and they weren't bringing home the meat, and they were off trading for other items, and that upset the balance of the economy. Then with Christianity coming in by that time, we came to Wisconsin. You saw a big change where the women were supposed to stay in the house and the men were out in the fields. So it's the opposite of the way our world was before.
In the fall of 1898, Miss Sybil Carter, who lived in New York City, introduced lace work to the Oneida women. The sisters taught the Oneida women until 1909. But then they gave up because the sisters had too much church work to do. Sybil Carter wanted the work to go on, so the association from New York City sent Miss Hemingway to Oneida to find somebody to teach us to make lace. Having learned the lace work where I went to school, I worked with her, as she taught me how to make cut work. Then she asked me to take charge. In the fall of 1909, they sent her to another Indian reservation to teach lace making. So she put me in charge of the lace makers. I used to have about 60 women. I used to give out the work for them to sew. The association used to furnish the supplies in making lace. I always sent the finished work every 2 weeks to the New York office. Sometimes $100 to $300 worth of finished work in one sending. The Oneida women made lots of lace. They made a bedspread. They made lots of altar lace. I had charge of the lace workers until 1926. The organization in New York City gave up the work, so the Oneida women living here were then without work.
Well, my name is Woodrow Wilson Webster. I was born about the time he was president, so they named me after him. My mother's name was Josephine, my father's name Isaac, and eventually my mother became the head of the lace making association in Oneida. She had about 3 who were more skillful in the real lace making. They were her top workers. Their lace that they made was put in competition in Paris, and it went up against Belgian-made lace there, and the Oneida lace work won out. They received a lot of blue ribbons on it. And my mother used to take them to the Brown County Fair and put them on exhibition, and nothing but blue ribbons for her.
One of the most interesting things from the journals is that a woman kept track of her family's income. They grew crops and corn, and they made money other ways. She made lace, and that lace was worth more than the crops. It was crucial to the family's income. You see, most Oneidas, they didn't have jobs, and they didn't speak English.
Two Oneidas were once walking on the road. They were going to a sawmill to look for a job, and both of these men could not talk or understand English. They had gone a long ways. They heard a rig coming from behind them. So one of the men asked the other to ask the driver how far the sawmill was.
Oh, Najwa, did you sleep? How far to...
I don't understand you.
How far to go? How far to cut? How far to?
I can't help you.
Daniel, lewa halo sek.
Wahale, onato, nisnes. How ya so jidewin?
Language was a big barrier in those days. Only a handful of Oneidas knew how to speak English, just enough English to get by. Today, our Oneida language is only spoken by a handful of Oneida elders and a handful of Oneida children. Education has provided us knowledge, but it's also taken our language away.
About this time, we got a new neighbor. They were white people, Seventh-day Advent people, who keep their Sundays on Saturday. Well, I got acquainted with them, only we had one trouble. I didn't know how to talk English, but in time I learned a little, so I could say a few words. They had a little girl about my age, I being about 7 years old at that time. We used to play together just like brother and sister. Finally, I knew a few words until I was able to talk with her. She used to teach me. We were playmates then. The people started school in their house, so I went to their school to learn ABCs. I used to think it was hard to remember the different letters. This little school turned out to be a boarding school. There were now about 12 boys and girls going to that school, and we used to play games in the evenings. Most of the children were Indians that belonged to that church. I never joined that church and kept my own Sunday. In the winter, we used to play in the snow, a game called Fox and Geese. That was a great game in those days. From there, I went to the Oneida boarding school. I was punished many times for talking Indian language. There we were taught to make our own bedrolls so that in case of fire, you can just grab the bundle and beat it. We also had to scrub our hands and knees to keep the room clean and take a bath once a week. Our clothing was furnished by the government. The larger boys did the farm work and took care of the milk cows. They had an instructor to teach them to farm and how to take care of dairy cows. Girls were taught to cook and bake bread. I never forgot the first stage play we had. I was chosen to be a king, and a girl was chosen to be a queen. How hard it was for me to memorize that little verse. I had to say when the curtains on the stage were open. I just forgot my verse that quick, and my queen had to tell me what to say. We were both dressed in snow white, with crowns on our heads.
I am the king.
We had rehearsed nearly 1 month. Still, I forgot mine by being stage frightened to see all the people in front of us.
In the boarding schools, the whole philosophy was to kill the Indian and save the man, which meant to civilize us. In their terms of civilization, which was to take everything about being Indian out of us. All these attempts to assimilate us brought us, took us farther and farther away from who we are. And of course, then we went through those long periods of poverty. Also, into the public schools, where of course we were taught that we were savages. And basically in 1890 with Wounded Knee, that was the end of Indians. It's kind of how the textbooks went.
Some days ago, I got to the home of an old lady whose name is Louise Christian. I was surprised and impressed by what she said about the work we are doing. She said that the Oneida language was a valuable language. She said that all her children were able to talk Oneida, and one granddaughter that she raised was able to talk it from a small child up, just as well as the English language. It is for that reason that I am well pleased to hear that there's a chance for everyone to go to school and learn from writing, so that we will not lose our language altogether.
We've been working on the language since the 70s in our community. We actually started our own school in 1979, our own elementary school, and the children received the language class every day. That's K through 8. Then in 1994, we added a high school to that. And for students to graduate from our high school, they are required to have at least 2 years of Oneida language. So that's been a good impact on the community. However, one of the problems was that we weren't producing fluent speakers. So in 1996, once we had funding again from the gaming, the tribe invested in a language revitalization program. And when it started, we had 11 elders who are fluent speakers, meaning that they learned Oneida as their first language. And we had 5 trainees. And since then, we've increased the trainees to 8. However, our elders now, we're down to only 2 who can come every day. And our big goal, is that within 20 years we'd have 100 certified language teachers.
The forced attendance in boarding schools brought much change. We learned to read and write in English, but at great cost. The smallpox epidemic also came with great cost. No person in this country was immune. Smallpox was a disease imported with immigrants from Europe. And early on, even in the 1600s, when the Pilgrims landed, there were hundreds of tribes and villages completely decimated and now extinct. The reason for such destruction was that native people had absolutely no immunity to that disease.
A long time ago, I heard an old lady tell a story of what happened here in Oneida. Henry Cornelius was the name of the man who came back from school. He was a man of good looks.
Can we have an apple, please?
Sure. He started a grocery store in the city of De Pere. The white men who kept stores in De Pere did not like this, as he was taking their trade away. He got a letter from someone, and in this letter were the germs of smallpox. So he got sick. There was no cure for it, and he gradually got worse and worse until he died. At his funeral, the casket was open for his friends to see him. So the smallpox was spread to many people. When the church was let out at his funeral, all the dogs on Ridge Road were howling. A few days after that, many people got sick, and every day someone else would die. And so sometimes there were 2 funerals in one day.
It is important to note that this story was written by one of our elders. Many scholars, both native and non-native, agree that the United States military not only discussed but implemented this attack against native people. Some historians believe it might have occurred, but insist that if it did, it was an isolated occurrence and not a conspiracy. There are some historians who believe that this direct contamination was an absolute fabrication. We Oneida believe it was done so that whatever opposition that Indians may have been perceived to give to colonials or to the military would be weakened.
In 1905, there was epidemic in the Oneida boarding school. And there I know that the superintendent and the doctor who was on duty called for assistance of other medical help. And quite a number of students died. And in fact, there is a burial ground in the vicinity of the area where Norbert Hill Center is now, which was previously the Oneida boarding school. In 1834, and leaving from St. Louis, there was a flatboat that was to go up the Missouri River on the regular trading trips and bringing some passengers. And when it left, the captain of the boat knew that there was an infected man with smallpox on the boat, and he did not return to St. Louis and take care of the problem immediately. Instead, he decided to go on up the entire Missouri, but send ahead a man on horseback to let the Indians know that there was smallpox on the boat and that they should not appear at the landings. The Indians, in fact, various tribes, thousands of people, thought that this was a trick and they were completely suspicious about it. And so they all appeared at the landings. And they were infected with the smallpox, and they died within days by the thousands. There was no one to bury them, and their bleach bones were on the prairie for a couple of years after that. And maybe more than a couple of years, but certainly everywhere along the Missouri River.
Smallpox was devastating to the Oneidas and other U.S. families. The pain, however, didn't stop there. There was more pain coming, the pain of losing their lands.
The Dawes Act was passed in 1887 by Congress. We didn't have any representatives in Congress because we were not voting for, not allowed to vote. We were not citizens of the United States, so the act was made about us and for us without our input whatsoever, no representation at all. And it was passed by Congress so that each Indian person could have his own individual piece of land out of the total. And so our land was prorated, where 90 acres were allotted to heads of household, and 45 acres were allotted to people that were 18 years of age or older and unmarried, and those under 18 were getting 26 acres. And it didn't matter if it were swamp or hills or good timber or farmland, it didn't matter. You got a piece of land within the boundaries. I have looked at the maps, and in one case for Hanyo Stevens, for instance, he had 90 acres, but it was distributed in 3 different parcels which were not close together. So even if he had a good farm, it wouldn't be economical for him to travel miles to another piece of land that he also owned. So I believe that those parcels were distributed the way they were deliberately, so that it would be easier for people to be alienated from their lands.
You could say we lived in heaven, up until the time a devil came to the Oneidas. He was well paid, too. A government agent worked with him. He got $2,000 for inducing and urging the Oneidas to become taxpayers. He got all of the people together at the parish hall for a meeting. He talked a lot, explained that so many white people were coming into Oneida but not being taxed. So he thought it best to establish a town where all of the people would pay taxes. All the older men disagreed with him. And so he failed at this meeting. He was so disappointed that he went around and talked to different people, especially those who were against him. He paid them $200 each to work on his side. So a few days after this, he called another meeting. All the men who were against him were now on his side. So the majority of the people voted on his side. And so the township was established, and they called it the town of Hobart. The Oneidas started to pay taxes. About 5 years after this, some of the Oneidas got behind in their taxes, and some began to lose what they had because they were not accustomed to paying taxes. It has always been so that if anything comes up, it always ends in loss for the Oneidas. This man who worked on establishing the town of Hobart, he was an Oneida Indian. He was hired by the white men to bring this about where the Oneidas live.
The Allotment Act provided that after everything is allotted, what is left over is declared surplus and falls to the United States. We had no extra land in our case, but the Sioux country and other tribes that the Dawes Allotment Act was applied to in the West did have surplus land, so immediately 100 million acres reverted, or I have to say just given to the United States of America, because the United States didn't own it in the first place. So it was just given to the United States. So 100 million acres fell to the United States immediately upon application of the Dawes Allotment Act to all the reservations. Eventually, almost all the land was alienated. So that was between 1911, 1929, of the Great Depression, because that's a cutoff point there. There were far more non-Indian people on the reservation than there were Indians. So what it did is the farmers voted in their own people, and the Oneidas were left without anything to say. And that is the case today.
The town of Hobart was in approximately 1910. It was created as a town, and it recently became a village in 2002 with special legislation. It was named after a Bishop Hobart who helped the Oneida Nation Indians move from New York State to Wisconsin, and they settled in the area that was originally Menominee Indian area. The village of Hobart lies entirely within the original boundaries of the Oneida Nation Reservation. It makes a very interesting working relationship, and it's also rewarding because of the rich culture. I think the Oneida Nation has similar standards and values as far as preserving the wildlife and the open spaces. I see businesses, commercial businesses, developing along some of the highway corridors. I see it predominantly residential, the rest of Hobart, and we're also concerned about preservation of farmland.
We, the Oneida Nation, are continually at odds with the townships because we have different purposes. Oneida would like to reacquire 51% of the land by 2020 within the reservation boundaries, and to provide homes and services for their membership, as was the intent in the first place in 1838. Unless the tribe purchases very rapidly the existing homes, they will not ever have political control in the foreseeable future on the reservation. They must buy the existing homes.
Long time ago, my grandpa would go to Boulder and they'd go logging, and my grandpa actually would go sometimes, and they'd come back and they didn't understand taxes. So as my grandfather and as my grandfather's grandfather came back, and my grandfather's father, Albert and Thomas, they turned around and saw that the Outagamie sheriff and his deputies on horseback were escorting those people out of the house. My grandpa didn't understand, and he was at home, and as his dad and grandpa were asking questions, they turned around and said, "You have to move out because you didn't pay your taxes." So then my grandpa was unpacking, and my grandpa's grandpa was trying to argue and say, "Well, here's your money," and pretty soon the wagon was full. So it was raining pretty hard, and there were only logs on the roads, and it was pretty muddy. So the sheriff and the deputy said, "You have to move on, you're loitering." And my grandpa looked up and he noticed that his father and his grandpa, they were both upset and they were crying, and one of them was crying so hard he couldn't shake the reins for the horse to move. took those reins and he shook them. All he remembers is seeing that water dripping off his hat on his hands, and the horses went down the road. When we talk about agriculture and how important that was to our people, the loss of our land through the treaties, both legal and illegal, was devastating to our people. And we fought to reclaim those lands. We've always filed land claims, and the land claims are still unresolved even today.
This suit over the land in New York, it goes back to our identity as Oneida people, as Oneida people. The name Oneida, which we refer to ourselves as, is people that stand stone. That name is referring to the geography of the region of New York State where we originated from. And so, I guess when you look at the overall picture here, we moved to Wisconsin, yes, but we never gave up our fight for that land in New York. By signing a settlement agreement that dissolves all Aboriginal title to that land, we're going ahead and we're telling not only the state of New York, but our other communities out there, is that land no longer means what it used to us. Land claims, it's an ongoing movement. It started back in the 60s. It's a movement by our people to reclaim lands that were taken illegally by the state of New York. When this whole concept of losing our land isn't just an Oneida problem. It's an Iroquois problem. It's an indigenous problem. There's been countless nations that have been displaced from their lands. We had the foresight to go ahead and take this to court. Successfully, we won a court case in 1985 at the Supreme Court level. After that, ongoing negotiations with the state of New York, and it's brought us to this point where there's really nothing settled. It's just been a lot of talk about, what kind of deal is acceptable on behalf of the state and the three communities of Oneidas. With the land, you have to look at it basically as we've always looked at it since the creation. Is that it was our duty to take that land and take care of it, to give thanks to that land for sustaining us. We lived on that land for generations, and our ancestors, they were buried in that land. And the only thing I've seen that this land claim has accomplished is we're not going to get a casino. We're not going to get that land. We only further separate our people, whether it's here in Wisconsin, the different groups that want to see that casino and they want to see this land claim settled. And then there's the groups that don't want to see this land claim settled. They want to see land. They want to have territory again in New York State. And to put all that aside for a gaming operation, whether it be profitable or not, isn't the question. The question is, again, our identity. Who do we see ourselves as in the future? Do we see ourselves as a gaming tribe, or do we see ourselves as Oneida?
The hardship of losing the land was unbearable for many Oneidas. For many years, Oneidas lived with high unemployment, alcoholism, and poverty. Life again was hard, but Oneida families had each other, and good fortune was on its way.
We've been very fortunate to have gaming. And it's, for the first time, we have an economy back in our community. And all of that money goes back into our community. And we provide services to as many of our 16,000 members as we can. We have a wonderful Oneida Health Center. That was a governmental priority to build a new health center. So we have that now, and it's a beautiful place. We have social services for all of our tribal members. And one of the earlier things we did at the beginning when we started to have some money was to build a beautiful child care center and youth programs. We have a wide variety of activities our youth can participate in, because we know that if we invest in our children today, that they are our future leaders, and we tell them that, and so we invest in them.
The time and money that we have invested into the WPA journals is priceless. If we had not participated in this project, we would have a large segment of our history just absent and not available to us.
An old man was always shelling corn, they say. He used to keep a basket of corn by his bed. Just as soon as he got up, he would start to shell the corn. It happened that it was on a Sunday morning, and he wanted to shell corn. But his granddaughter told him that it was Sunday this particular day, and therefore not to do any work. So the elder man laid down. He fell asleep again for just a little while, and when he awoke, he started to shell the corn again. His granddaughter again stopped him, so he went back to bed. When he awoke, he pulled his basket of corn towards him. His granddaughter stopped him for a third time. Finally, the old man said,
"Is every day Sunday?"
There's a thing called a big fancy word, syncretism, that I just love. And that's taking your ways, what you know, and taking the new things and adapting them in and mixing them together. And that's something I think Oneida people have done in the most magnificent way. We still raise our white corn, and we have this beautiful cannery, but it keeps that ancient form of the white corn alive. And people purchase the white corn like for weddings and funerals and birthdays and for presents and gifts. And we still continue to eat that white corn, which was a staple of our diet. That's syncretism. You go to the Episcopal Church and they sing the hymns in the Oneida language. That's syncretism.
In closing my history about Oneidas, I wish to thank those who were so kind and interested about us Oneidas, to give us a chance to tell about ourselves and to get a true picture of Oneidas as a whole. I trust us Oneidas will benefit from our true Oneida Indian history sometime in the future.
I believe it's maybe one of the most important things we can do for our people, for that next 7 generations coming up, is to tell our story. Because the signs of being the most assimilated and colonized, when they've accomplished what they wanted to do to us, is when we tell their version of our story. So it's absolutely critical that we tell our own story. And that takes courage.
Life in general, compared to the time when I was a child growing up here, is very good in terms of material things. I think that we are lacking some of the culture of the time I was growing up. For example, people would help one another, always. If someone was sick in a family, you would see all the neighbors and relatives help that family. They have lost that closeness altogether, and I think that's one of the major things that we should strive for. The WPA story should be published and told to everyone. I believe that they should be published in segments, probably according to topic, and then distributed free to every tribal member. Every tribal member needs to understand where they came from. They need to be connected. And this is one of the greatest connecting kind of things that we can do. It's right there before us. All we have to do is utilize it.
Yone no hayo, no heyo, no heyane, no hayo, gai